Now we're going to look at the skeletal system and some of the functions of that system made up of bones. So bone is made up of several different types of tissue all working together to form a structure. So we have osseous tissue, or what we think of as bone, cartilage, dense connective tissue, epithelial, several different types of blood-forming tissues, adipose tissue, or what we call fat, and also nervous tissue. Now remember, an organ is when we have several different types of tissue coming together for a common purpose. So individual organs of the skeletal system are not just bone. Remember, bone is the tissue. So the different organs are the femur, the ribs, the vertebrae, all the different named bones. So those are the organ. So each individual bone is an organ, and the bones along with their cartilage make up the skeletal system. So the skeletal system has several different functions. First of all, bones support the soft tissues of the body and provide attachment sites for muscles. So when muscles attach to bones and those muscles contract, then the body moves. Many of the internal organs are also protected by bony coverings. So think about your brain. It's located within your cranium, so all the bones of the skull protect the brain. The ribs protect the heart and the lungs, so many organs are protected by those hard bony coverings. Bones assist skeletal muscle to move parts of the body. So when the muscles of your arm contract, it pulls on those bones and then the body moves. When you walk, you have muscles contracting and pulling on bones. Also, your bones are storage spaces for several minerals, such as calcium and phosphates, that are needed to be released in the blood when our levels are low, so that we have proper functioning of cells, such as muscle cells that have to have calcium to contract. So we combine the calcium with the phosphorus and we store it in the bone matrix, so we have that when we need additional calcium in the blood. Within the bone marrow, there are specialized stem cells called hematopoietic stem cells. So that's just a big word that means blood-forming stem cells. So hematopoiesis or hemopoiesis, same term or same thing, participates in forming the blood cells. So the erythrocytes or red blood cells, the leukocytes, white blood cells, and the platelets, which are actually called thrombocytes, all of those are formed in the bone marrow from those stem cells there. And then the final function that we'll look at is the storage of triglycerides, or fats, are stored in the yellow bone marrow. Okay, so let's talk about structure of bone. It's easiest to understand the structure of bone if we begin by looking at a long bone. So a typical long bone consists of a shaft that we call the diaphysis. At the ends of the long bones, where they typically are going to join other bones and form joints or articulations, we have these enlarged areas called epiphyses. We have hyaline cartilage that makes up the articular or articulating cartilage that covers the epiphyses, or the ends of the long bones. This cartilage helps to reduce friction and absorb shock because those joints are constantly moving and bearing weight. We have a connective tissue covering that covers the surface of the bone and contains osteogenic or bone-forming cells that promotes growth, both in the length of the bone as well as in width. Helps to get nutrients and nourishing blood into that bone, and also serves as a point of attachment for ligaments and tendons. The medullary cavity, or the marrow cavity, is the space within the bone that is filled with marrow. So it's going to be a space that runs the length of the diaphysis. And then the endosteum, remember endo means inside, so the endosteum is a thin membrane that lines that medullary cavity. So you should see here you've got two words that look very similar, periosteum and endosteum. Peri means around, oste refers to bone, and the eum is typically going to mean a covering. So covering around the bone and within the bone. So bone or osseous tissue is made up of lots of cells all put together within a matrix. So let's look first, before we consider the cells that are making up this bone, at the typical structure. So remember, the shaft of a long bone is the diaphysis. Running the length of, or most of the length of that diaphysis, there's your medullary cavity that may be filled with yellow marrow. Here you have the enlarged areas at the end of the bone. So these are the epiphyses, and we have a layer of very hard, tightly packed together bone around the outside. That is the compact bone. And then we have spongy bone that is going to fill a lot of the epiphyses at both ends, and also come down just a little bit into the diaphysis of that bone. In addition to that, you can see the articular cartilage here at the ends of the bone, and this is going to cover the bone where it meets with another bone and forms a joint. Here you can see a blown up image of that, so you can actually see the compact versus the spongy bone a little bit better. So we've got a humerus, or an upper arm bone. You can see the outside is made up of the compact bone, so that's going to be bone that is very, very tightly packed together, and that's going to be very, very hard. And then you can see the spongy bone within, and that of course looks like a sponge. So we'll examine that structure just a little bit more as well, and talk about the cells that are making up this bone. So bone or osseous tissue consists of widely separated cells surrounded by a large amount of matrix or bony tissue. So there are 4 principal types of bone cells. Even though we only have 3 listed here, on the next slide we'll see that 4th one as well. Your osteogenic cells, genesis means the beginning, so osteogenic cells are going to be the cells that undergo cell division, and then they will develop into osteoblast. So your blast are your builders. So these are going to be the cells that build up the bony matrix. Once they do so, they become mature bone cells that are responsible for promoting bone deposition, or for maintaining that bone once it has been created. And those are your osteocytes. So osteocytes maintain the bone. Osteoblasts build the bone. And then your osteoclast. When you see clast, I want you to think of crashers. So your osteoclast are the ones, the cells that are going to break down bone, and as they do so, they're going to release calcium into the blood. So on the next slide, we can actually see an image of these cells. So your osteoprogenitor or osteogenic cells are going to develop into osteoblasts that build the bone. Your osteocytes are the mature bone cells that maintain the bone, and then your osteoclast break down bone when we need additional bone tissue, or when we need additional calcium in the blood. Alright, so the matrix of a bone contains inorganic salts, primarily a calcium phosphate or calcium carbonate. So we call those calcium salts hydroxyapatite. And then, of course, we also have some collagen fibers that help to make up that bony tissue as well. So compact bone is going to be very good at providing protection and support because it's very hard, it's tightly packed together. Your spongy bone is going to be lightweight and filled with marrow, and that helps the bone to be more lightweight so that your bones are not really heavy. Okay, so when we're looking at making bone, remember we're laying down these calcium salts with some collagen fibers and making up the matrix of this bone, and these osteoblasts are going to be the cells that are doing that. So depending on the size and the distribution of the spaces between the hard components of bone, that's what determines whether the bone is going to be categorized as spongy or compact. So compact bone, as you see here in this image, is made up of these little structures called osteons, or Haversian canals or Haversian systems. So here you've got an osteon, there you've got an osteon. there's one, and there's one, and there's one, and here you have two that are cut in half. So the osteons are the structures that make up your compact bone. So it's found on the outside of bones. Your osteons contain blood vessels and lymphatic vessels and nerves and mature osteocytes along with that calcified matrix. So here you can see one osteon, and it looks like rings within a tree. So each of those little rings is a structure called a lamellae. Okay, so the rings are the lamellae, and then you see within those you have these little areas. So let's look at the blown up image out here. And there you've got some lamellae. So we're going to take just a little bit of that and bring it out here, and there's a big old osteocyte. So that's a mature bone cell where it has laid down bone matrix all around it, forming those tree rings, the lamellae, and then the osteocyte gets trapped within all that bony tissue. Once it's trapped in that tissue, it stops making bone matrix and just becomes a mature osteocyte that is there to maintain that cell. Now, between all these lamellae, you see all these little branch-looking things within here. These are little canals called canaliculi. So those provide an area for all these mature osteocytes that are trapped to be able to communicate with each other. And when I say communicate, that means to allow chemicals to pass from one cell to another and to act as a whole or act as a unit to work together to maintain bone or to break down bone if we need more calcium in there. So those tiny little canals are your canaliculi, and here in this central canal you've got your major blood vessels coming in. So your bone tissue is very, very highly vascular. Another thing to notice here when you're looking at the structure of compact bone is all of your osteons are aligned in the same direction, and they're aligned along the lines of stress on that bone. So because these long tubular structures of all of these osteons are in the same direction, this allows these bones to be able to withstand a lot of force. Okay, so now let's look at spongy bone. Spongy bone is sometimes also called cancellous bone. So it doesn't contain osteons, but instead it has these little sort of branch structures called trabeculae. Okay, so the trabeculae form all these little spongy looking areas, and in the spaces between the trabeculae we have marrow. So a lot of the red marrow is found in the spaces between these. So it forms most of the interior structure of the short, flat, and irregular bones, and also the epiphyses of some of the long bones. Because there's so much space between the bone or osseous tissue, the spongy bone is going to be very lightweight and provides those open spaces for the red marrow, and that's where hematopoiesis, or making of those blood cells, is going to occur. One thing I do want to point out here before we move away from the spongy bone is when someone is suspected of having something such as osteoporosis, you can do a scan or imaging of that spongy bone, and you'll see that a lot of these trabeculae start to break down or become very, very brittle, not as solid, and you have a lot more space within there. And of course all that space is going to take away from the strength or the structure of that bone, and the bones become much more fragile. Bones do have a very, very rich blood and nerve supply. So because of that, a lot of nutrient-rich blood is coming in, so bones tend to heal very quickly as compared to some of the connective tissues. So this shows you some of the blood structures, or the arteries and the veins that are coming in. So you've got periosteal arteries. Remember, the periosteum is that covering. So these arteries are going to come in through that diaphysis in these structures called Volkmann's canal, or Volkmann's canals. So they come in and bring that rich blood supply in, and then they're going to branch into smaller and smaller arteries, into these little nutrient arteries that are going to supply the diaphysis. The epiphyses also have arteries, and anywhere you've got arteries bringing in nice rich blood, you've got to have veins bringing that used or dirty blood or deoxygenated blood back out. So where you have the arteries bringing blood in, you're going to have the veins bringing blood out. In addition to that, nerves are typically going to follow these blood vessels into the bony tissue and the periosteum so that they can sense damage to that bone and send that information to the brain in the form of a pain message. Alright, so here you can see the periosteum surrounding that diaphysis of the bone, and you can see these nice rich nutrient arteries coming in and veins going back out, and then they're going to branch into smaller and smaller and smaller vessels, making sure that that bone tissue, the spongy bone as well as the compact bone, has a very rich blood supply. Alright, so I think we'll stop here and begin a new video when we start looking at how bone is formed.